This 920-page document would usher in the most conservative executive branch in modern American history, if enacted. It's called Project 2025. Its pages offer new administrations a blueprint for executing a right-wing agenda, from purging the government of thousands of civil servants to dismantling the Department of Education. The project has 4 main pillars: a policy plan, a personnel database, an online academy, and a playbook for the president's first 180 days in office. The first pillar is a policy agenda that focuses on dismantling the so-called administrative state, or what some conservatives call the deep state.
Either the deep state destroys America, or we destroy the deep state.
For Project 2025, dismantling the administrative state means purging the civil workforce of tens of thousands of federal employees and replacing them with conservative, pre-vetted picks. The plan would dismantle the Department of Homeland Security, eliminate the Department of Education entirely, and transform the FBI into a political task force that is accountable to the president. The playbook also outlines a plan to bring many federal agencies, like the Department of Justice, under more direct presidential control.
Second of all, I think that it's really important that people understand that Project 2025 is actually already underway. As someone who served in the Texas House and had to endure the Heritage Foundation sending bills, because that's exactly what they've been doing, is they've been sending bills through our state houses and our state senates. That is how we got to the point that we ended up with these abortion bans. They called it the heartbeat bill in the state of Texas. That is something that they pass along to Texas. They pass it along to Florida. And so what people need to understand and decide is, if you like the direction that this country is going as it relates to our Supreme Court that has eviscerated our Constitution, that seemingly doesn't care anything about court precedents and seemingly only wants to bow down to Trump as if they are serving him in the way that Eileen Cannon just did, then that is what you will get more of. If you want to live in a country in which you are force-fed this pseudo-Christianity, where you have to believe in God and do the things that they say their God wants you to do, which I argue is the same God that they use to justify slavery in the first place. And then when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion and what they've done in the Supreme Court, we already see this actually taking place. The issue that we don't understand is that the last kind of nail in the coffin is Trump getting into the presidency. And the scariest part about that is that, let's say he decides he doesn't want to leave the White House. Well, who's going to check him? Because the Supreme Court has decided that checking him is not really something they're interested in doing.
Let's see. You're the executive director for the America First Legal, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And America First Legal is a member of Project 2025, which is dedicated to creating the playbook for the next conservative administration and what it calls the Project Pillars, correct?
We are proud contributors to Project 2025.
Okay. And are you familiar with Project 2025's mandate for leadership?
In fact, I am.
All right, so let's walk through some of the provisions of the mandate. It calls for eliminating the Department of Education, eliminating the Department of Commerce, deploying the military for the use of domestic law enforcement against protesters under the Insurrection Act of 1807. It also has the repealing of Schedule F status for thousands of federal employees to allow a president to replace career civil servants with unqualified partisan loyalists. That's probably my favorite of it. It also prohibits the FBI from combating the spread of misinformation and disinformation, like Russia and China, who are actively trying to interfere with American elections. I don't know why or how anybody can support Project 2025. And I know that there was allegedly a joke about dictators and whether or not that's funny, but in the United States of America, dictatorships are never funny. And Project 2025 is giving the playbook for authoritarianism as well as the next dictator to come in. And
what Project 2025 articulates is the idea that the president should be the one directing the activities of the Department of Justice, even if that means that the president will not be investigated or that the DOJ will be sent to attack the president's political enemies.
We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
The Heritage Foundation says it wants to ensure that what remains of this whittled-down federal bureaucracy is conservative, not just for the next president, but for a long time to come. Pillar 2, Personnel Database. The Heritage Foundation has already contracted the technology company Oracle to build this database, kind of like a conservative networking platform.
Trump really emphasizes loyalty, and you see those practices now being adopted by Project 2025, where you fill out a form that essentially indicates if you are loyal to President Trump or not.
Once they're fully vetted, they can move on to Pillar 3, an online presidential administration academy that would train future bureaucrats in conservative values and governing.
So we want these people who are competent, who have great credentials, to be prepared for the specific job that they will have.
Project 2025 provides detailed policy plans for dozens of government agencies, outlining ways to create de facto abortion bans, slash federal investment in renewable energy, and roll back environmental regulations. Here, you can see several sections dedicated to consolidating U.S. immigration agencies and expanding their power. But how legally sound are these policy proposals, and what would they look like in practice? That's where Pillar 4 comes in, the playbook for the first 180 days of a conservative presidency. A big part of the plan is modeled off of a Trump-era policy called Schedule F.
Schedule F is originally an executive order that Trump signed that would allow him to turn thousands of career civil servants into political appointees that he could then fire if they displeased him in any way, and then have to be more responsive to a president who in the past has shown a willingness to fire people for disloyalty rather than for competence.
The Biden administration reversed this order in 2021, but Trump has vowed to bring it back if he is reelected.
First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively.
Back in 2022, Trump spoke to the Heritage Foundation and was direct about its role in crafting future policy.
This is a great group, and they're going to lay the groundwork and detail plans for exactly what our movement will do and what your movement will do when the American people give us a colossal mandate to save America, and that's coming. That's coming.
We are continuing our commitment to read and explain Project 2025, the far-right Christian nationalist plan for the next Republican presidency. And today we're looking at Chapter 11, which is the Department of Education. Now, the first proposal in here is simple enough. This is from the first sentence of the chapter, where it says, ultimately, the federal Department of Education should be eliminated. But of course, it's not so simple. The chapter goes on to outline a long list of radical action to reshape this country's education system from top to bottom. That list includes dismantle the Department of Education, end the Head Start program for young children in poverty, end the Title I funding for schools serving low-income children, rescind federal civil rights protections for LGBTQ plus students, undercut federal capacity to enforce civil rights law, reduce federal funding for students with disabilities, and remove guardrails designed to ensure that these children are adequately served by schools, privatize the federal student loan portfolio and end student loan forgiveness, and promote universal private school choice. Let's talk about that last one, what they mean by universal private school choice. What it means is that vouchers designed to help families pay for private school if they don't want their kids in public school. On the very first page of the chapter on education, the author calls out Arizona's school choice voucher model as the model for the rest of the country to follow. So let's take a look at that Arizona voucher program. The state promised families in the program an average of $7,000 a year to spend on the private school of their choosing or other non-public options, which include homeschooling, tutoring, or charter schools. But the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting found that roughly 60% of vouchers were going to students whose families were already paying for private school education, meaning that taxpayer dollars are actually subsidizing private school education for families that can already afford it while siphoning money out of the public school system. Quote, Arizona has taken hundreds of millions in new spending for kids who were already attending private schools, a trend that contributed to a $1 billion plus budget deficit this year. Plus, a recent analysis by the Hechinger Report found that of the Arizona schools that posted their tuition rates publicly, nearly all of them raised their tuition the same year that those vouchers became available, making the schools far more expensive than what's actually covered by the vouchers. That means that many low-income families were left with thousands of dollars in tuition that they suddenly had to cover themselves with no notice. So-called school choice programs also appear to disproportionately benefit religious schools. What a shock, right? According to the Washington Post, an analysis of voucher programs, 87% of Arizona's voucher money went to religious schools. While Arizona has the nation's most expansive voucher program, 10 other states have similar programs. 17 more states have smaller voucher systems. The same Washington Post analysis found that in those 28 states that provide public funding for private school vouchers, the vast majority of the money ends up going to religious schools. What a shocker, which translates to billions of dollars in public education funding being lost. In some states, as much as 98% of voucher funding goes to religious schools. So, to recap, Arizona gave students in the school choice program roughly $7,000 each, made up of funding that used to go to public schools in order to allow them to choose their own non-public option. But the voucher doesn't cover the full amount of tuition at those schools, so families who already pay for tuition get a tuition break, while families who can't pay the tuition are forced back into public schools, where they're now receiving even fewer resources. Plus, students with special needs are no longer guaranteed spots because non-public schools don't have to admit them. Beyond privatizing schools and eliminating most of the protections for disadvantaged students, Project 2025 also seeks to take on the so-called woke agenda in education. Woke is all through this document, by the way, even though regular people don't use that expression. As Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts puts so clearly in his foreword, quote, the noxious tenets of critical race theory and gender ideology should be excised from curricula in every public school in the country, end quote. As ever, Project 2025 clearly seeks to increase rights and access for certain people while removing protections for other people. The chapter on education specifically calls to eliminate protections for trans and non-binary students, maintaining the far-right trend of attacking transgender people. It also recommends putting the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which was established under the Civil Rights Act in order to ensure that schools and programs that receive federal funding comply with civil rights laws, under the control of the Department of Justice. But you may recall from our earlier reporting on Project 2025 that it wants to put the DOJ under more direct presidential control, which means that under Project 2025, the Office of Civil Rights in the Education Department would likely fall under direct presidential influence. So yes, if you have money to spend and children with no special needs and no learning differences, and you live in an urban area, you may have more choice for your child under Project 2025. But for students with special needs, options are increasingly limited for even well-resourced families. Families report being turned away from private schools, religious schools, and even special ed-focused charter schools because ultimately, under voucher systems, it's the schools that have the power to choose their students, not the other way around. Our Department of Education was designed specifically to ensure that all children in this country have equal access to quality education. I agree. That doesn't always come to pass, but that's the point of the exercise. But Project 2025 aims to dismantle that for what they say is the promise of freedom and choice. Freedom and choice for who? Before the break, we told you about Project 2025's plan to dismantle the Department of Education, including a series of policy proposals that take away funding and protections from the most vulnerable students in the country, particularly low-income students and students with disabilities. Joining me now is Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, the largest teachers union in the country. Randy, thanks for being here. There's a lot, Project 2025 is a mess. It's a hot mess. It's a disorganized thing. So it's hard to kind of organize the thoughts and translate it into normal people speak. But we've tried to do that. And I want to just get your take on that. What have we missed anything, or is there something else in there that you want to bring up to our audience?
First off, Ali, you would get an A++++ if you were in my AP Gov course, because you said it. I mean, it was brilliant the way in which you just rolled it out in very plain English. But let me try to say it this way. We live in a capitalist society, and competition and choice are, part of what's in our capitalist democracy. But we also live in a society that believes we have to educate all kids. So we have to create a ladder of opportunity for all kids. That includes kids with special needs. That includes kids who are poor, kids who are middle class, kids who are rich. And what Project 2025 does is it basically takes that ladder of opportunity and it crashes and burns it. It basically says, if you are already in a family that has means, fine, you're going to have a lot of choices. Everybody else, we're defunding public schools and we're giving money to private schools or to religious schools, but private schools that then hike up the tuition. So it essentially means that only the rich can have those choices. That's essentially what it's doing. So that's what we're seeing in Arizona. That's what we're seeing in Iowa. That's what we're seeing in Florida and these other places. So it completely takes away and abolishes this notion of opportunity for all and of knowledge for all. So that's on the economic side. On the side about the cultural wars, it's even as more venal than that, because it's essentially saying we're not going to teach honest history. We're not going to teach critical thinking. We're not going to see all of our students. We're going to have a very, very, very bifurcated, binary way of saying either you are this way or you don't matter. And the third thing I would say is what it is afraid of actual real knowledge. Why would you be afraid of teaching honest history to American school children? Why would you be afraid of saying this is the good in America and this is what people like King and others have tried to change? And why would we not teach American kids all the things they need to know to actually live their lives? And why would we not allow kids to go to college even if they're poor? So it really takes away opportunity from every child who doesn't come from a rich family.
School choice sounds great, as you said, and we are in a capitalist society. But if you live in a place, often school systems work better in places where there's higher income, property taxes are higher, the taxes are higher, you can pay for more things. If you live in a place where you'd like your public education to be better, and you take each student who isn't going to be in the public education system, you take the public funding for them out of the system, you're simply not making that district better. You're empirically making
Correct.
it worse for everybody else who's left behind.
And this is what happens with that, because it happens in rural areas and it happens in urban areas. If you say you have a school with 100 kids and now all of a sudden you have 95 kids. You took that money from those 5 kids, or you did it in whatever Arizona is doing it or other ways of doing it. This is what happens. You get rid of the librarian, or you get rid of the gym teacher, or you get rid of the art teacher or the music teacher, because we're still going to have classes that have English and math. So the things that really resonate for kids, you get rid of. I taught in New York City in the 1990s during a recession. We scavenged for chalk, but this is what we tried to do. We tried to keep the AP Gov course that I'm teaching. We tried to keep the health courses that we were teaching, so we had pathways for kids to go into career tech ed or healthcare. But schools across America are making these choices all the time. That's what it means when we're talking about defunding schools. And so think about the other thing, which is what's also venal about Project 2025. They want to take the meal programs away from kids. They want to take civil rights away from kids. So how do we help kids become the middle class? How do we help kids go from struggling to striving if they take this funding away? We have to strengthen public schools. We have to do different things to meet the needs of kids, of course. But there's nothing other than a public school system that spells opportunity in America.
Project 2025 isn't just about the ultra-conservative policies that Donald Trump and his allies are preparing for a possible second term in office. It's about how they're going to implement those policies. During his first term, Trump often grew frustrated with senior federal government employees who prevented him from acting on his worst impulses and refused to carry out some of his most extreme ideas. He called his bureaucratic detractors members of the so-called deep state, which is an ill-defined, shadowy entity that he's vowed to dismantle. He and his Project 2025 allies already know how they'll do this, and it largely involves an objective or a directive known as Schedule F. It's a plan that would radically transform the federal bureaucracy and allow Trump to install loyalists all across the federal government. Now, in this regard, Project 2025, which, as you know, I have right here, quite literally picks up where Trump's first term left off. On October 21st, 2020, just 2 weeks before Election Day, Donald Trump signed an executive order that created a new classification of government workers that would be known as Schedule F employees. That sounds rather harmless, but in reality, Schedule F was an effort to drastically reorganize the government in order to give the president more power and control over the federal workforce. Anyone deemed to be in a policy-determining, policy-making, or policy-advocating position would be reclassified as a Schedule F employee. As per Trump's executive order, Schedule F employees would lose their civil service job protections, which meant that replacing them would become a lot easier. They would essentially become political appointees, hired and fired at the will of the president, and possibly replaced by somebody who may not be equally or better qualified, but who won't question the Trump administration's agenda or method of doing things. It's a system designed to reward loyalty over expertise.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all, and corruption it is. First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively.
I will wield that power very aggressively. Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, the group behind Project 2025, has echoed Trump's sentiment. Speaking of the career civil servants who would be most directly affected by Schedule F, Roberts told the New York Times earlier this year, quote, "We want them out of there. We want Schedule F." Meanwhile, Project 2025 is already preparing for the opportunity to get rid of Schedule F employees and replace them with their own people. In fact, Project 2025 has already pre-vetted thousands of prospective employees to ensure that they are ideologically aligned with the group. The qualification under the Trump administration is not going to be that you are better for the job. It's that you're ideologically aligned. Project 2025 has gone as far as to create an employment database that's been described as a, quote, conservative LinkedIn. Joining me now is Olivia Troy, former Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence and member of the new voter outreach group, Republicans for Harris. Olivia, great to see you again. You know, one of the things I learned from my parents who were involved in politics when I was very young is that in a functioning point of the civil service is that you can elect different leaders and they can come and go, but the system stays relatively steady because experts, generally speaking, who are not driven by ideology, keep the government working. Project 2025 wants to undo that largely.
Yeah, I want to be very clear about this, Ali. This Schedule F order, this was drafted, as you said, in 2020. I saw the draft when it was being enacted early on in 2020, and that is when they started to replace national security experts on the National Security Council with loyalists. And, I was warned about it from my boss and from the National Security Advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence. I was told to keep my head down, and I was told that in the end, hopefully, I would be okay. And the reason that was stated to me was because they knew that I was committed to serving in the Homeland Security and counterterrorism role in a very factual, matter-of-fact way. I worked day and night to ensure that I was presenting the facts and also responding. I worked on the disaster relief that you mentioned whenever there was a hurricane or floods or California wildfires. But the concern here with this Schedule F was that in situations when Trump did not want to send relief to a blue state, if those people that are serving in a nonpartisan way get replaced by a loyalist, That is what's at stake here, is that it will no longer be a government working for the greater good of the people and providing this relief. It will be we're not going to send relief like they did during COVID, right? I lived that firsthand, where they were playing partisan politics. I will be very clear, Mike Pence was not, but we had no control over what was going on in that Oval Office, where they were doing partisan politics when they were sending supplies and relief to states based on how they had voted. And I think that is a very dangerous thing here. And I think that Americans really need to understand that. Because when, let's say Donald Trump gets upset with a Republican governor along the way, and he's back in the Oval Office, I can assure you that his vengeance will overtake in the moment, and he will forget about the fact that these are just Americans in need right there, and he will be vengeful, and he will keep that relief from going out, and it'll be the partisan loyalists in charge that are going to be dictating responses and policies like that. And I can name numerous scenarios across the board where that is likely to be the case.
Yeah, it's important for people to understand, because I think the civil service is an abstraction to a lot of people who don't work in the civil service. But to understand that it is designed, by design, not a partisan body, by a partisan workforce, is really important. This should be like go and hug a civil servant week, just to understand that they do their job. They have political opinions. They have a right to have political opinions, and they vote. But when you're working for the American people, it should be expertise over ideology. Thanks for giving us a window into this one, Olivia. It's always good to see you. Olivia Troy, former Homeland Security, counterterror, and intelligence official, among other things, in the U.S. government. Project 2025 dedicates 6 entire chapters to the common defense. They're filled with chilling proposals. These chapters include the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and the intelligence community. The goal is to purge these agencies of any obstacles to Trump's authority and make the right-wing's culture wars a permanent feature of governance, including anti-trans and anti-diversity initiatives. Chapter 4 of Project 2025 is devoted to the Department of Defense, and it's authored by a former defense official. Its proposals include purging the military's leadership's ranks and advocating for the removal of generals based on their perceived political bias. Proposals also include eliminating what it terms, quote, divisive critical race theory programs and DEI initiatives. Project 2025 also calls for the National Security Council to conduct a rigorous review of all promotions of military generals to root out what it terms social engineering and non-defense matters. Social engineering is defined here as a broad spectrum of things that the right wing is allergic to, including climate change, critical race theory, and DEI training. While presidents have the authority to remove generals, the grounds have traditionally been based on poor performance. Doing so as a political act would tarnish the perception of the military as being apolitical. Critics warn that purging the military ranks for partisan reasons could erode crucial safeguards against dangerous orders, potentially undermining the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which states that soldiers are not obligated to follow unlawful orders. He then describes a troubling scenario if the military is politicized. Imagine a situation where a large group of activists gather outside the White House. Quote, as their numbers begin to swell, as their voices grow louder, the president issues an order to military commanders, take them out. Our military leadership would then be faced with an impossible choice. They'd either have to follow the clearly unlawful order of their commander-in-chief and commit crimes for which they could be prosecuted, or openly defy that order, end quote. Joining me now for more on Project 2025's plans for America's defense and security is Mark Zaid. He's the executive director and founder of the James Madison Project, which educates the public on intelligence gathering and operations, national security, and government run.
A lot of partisan issues. And it talks about rooting out people and essentially setting up loyalty tests to make sure that anyone within the intelligence community who basically doesn't kiss the ring of King Donald Trump, in essence, must be removed from the community. We've never seen anything like that before. Essentially, it is advocating a purge of anyone who might disagree with a second Trump administration.
Part of this vision is reflected not just in its policy proposals, but in something we like to point out here is some of the people involved. One such person, it's a name we haven't talked about for a long time, but it came up again this week, John Yoo. He's a former Justice Department lawyer under the Bush administration. He authored the infamous torture memos, which justified the use of torture in the war on terror. And actually, those torture policies have contributed to the news we've just had this week about Guantanamo's continued existence and the delayed prosecution for Guantanamo detainees. John Yoo is now a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. That's one of Project 2025's key backers. And he recently wrote a chilling op-ed in the National Review calling for revenge prosecutions against Democrats. One Trump attorney gleefully called that the vengeance memo. Talk to me about the dangers of this.
Right. So when John Yoo's memo on torture or enhanced interrogation came out back in the first Bush administration, I was working mostly in the international human rights community, dealing with war crimes and terrorism. And we could look at the memo and say, all right, this is a lawyer advocating a position. I don't have to agree with it, but I could understand at least some of the legal arguments. This is different. This is not a legal policy advocation that John Yoo has come up. It is an actual retribution policy, revenge policy. He has basically said a biblical eye for an eye. They did it to us. We should exercise our authority to do it to them. Whether doing it to them was the same or anything or justified. He singles out further prosecution of Hunter Biden for, if I recall, connections to foreign governments, as if Hunter Biden had anything to do with the Biden administration. He's a civilian family member. It's a scary proposal that is very similar to Project 2025 that goes well beyond ideological views and policy shifts that a certain segment of the population might want. It is revengeful, it is spiteful, it is hateful, and it is authoritarian, much in the way you were talking about with Venezuela.